Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepytimetales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to ask you for a couple of minutes of your time. I usually take this time to ask for financial support and shill out the Patreon and the buy me a coffee. But I'm turning this on its head for a few weeks. Because while money is handy, it is after all how we buy things and how I pay for the services that are used for this podcast. The real engine of any medium, whether podcast or TV show or book, is people who love it, sharing it. So this is my appeal to you tonight. A lot of people are struggling to sleep these days. Times are hard and stress is everywhere, and I'd like you to spread the word. If there are people in your life who struggle to sleep, tell them about Sleepytimetales. There may be people who you'll need to teach how to listen to a podcast. If you're a podcast listener and someone isn't, you may be introducing them to a whole new world, even outside of this weird little project of mine. And of course, very importantly, if you share on social media, please make sure to mention me. My tag is at Sleepytimetales on Instagram and Twitter, so I can thank you and I can give you a shout out here. I don't advertise. I'm not sure if I could effectively and economically advertise the show. And the idea of giving Facebook or Google money to spread the word just really rubs me up the wrong way. So you spreading the word, sharing this show, is what I depend on to help it grow and to reach new people. And of course, I do have to bring up the financial stuff. This show is supported by listeners like you, mostly on Patreon, but a good number of people throw a few dollars every month my way via Buy Me a Coffee or the PayPal tip jar. I'm not going to go into too much detail tonight, but if you are inclined to help support the show, and would like to see what bonuses are available up on the Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/sleepytimetales and see what little rewards you can get, in addition to the knowledge that you're helping other people get a restful night as well. And last but not least, I've got to shout out the music. The song is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. The music is available on their website at royaltyfreakmusic.com. I've linked it in the show notes as they've got some very cool stuff that they release under various names that I recommend checking out. Thanks for taking the time. Let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepytimetales? What is it for? What is this strange thing, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning in emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepytimetales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or maybe sometimes background noise or simply company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you without any pressure of the end being upcoming. As far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage. The primary idea with Sleepytimetales is to give you something to focus on, a story or an event that lets you keep your mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stresses and anxieties, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for you. But some people might need something a little bit different, maybe something a little bit more like background noise, or some kind of white noise. Some people like the sound of the rain, or the ocean, or the wind in the trees, or maybe some people just find it handy to have a boring dude telling them some story. But however you find it helpful to engage with the show, it's important that you don't try force the sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and allow sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you get to sleep before the end of the episode, but it is important that you don't feel pressurized. Especially if this is your first night, this probably won't work for you. I recommend giving it a solid 3 nights try. Try to get into a new habit and get over some of the things that may make Sleepytimetales seem a little bit strange. You may need some time to get used to listening to my voice. Maybe my accent is strange to you. Or maybe one episode just isn't long enough, at least early on. Or maybe your problem isn't so much going to sleep. Maybe your problem is waking up in the middle of the night. One thing you can try to do is maybe download a few episodes of the show and put them all in a playlist and let them run in the course of the night. So that if you find yourself waking up at 3 a.m. and staring at the ceiling, you can just, if your earbuds have fallen out or if it's still going on in the background, you can just carry on listening and waft back to sleep again. Another thing I've often recommended to people, and I've had people thank me for it despite the fact it sounds a little bit strange, is if you wake up like 30 minutes or 60 minutes before the alarm, just do the same thing. If your earbuds have fallen out, pop them back in. If the show is running in the background on your smart speaker, just start listening again, and you'll find yourself, if you fall asleep, you may end up with the best part of your night. Because there's something about relaxing deeply right before the alarm that is refreshing on a whole new level. But however you're engaging with the show, whether it's early in the night, middle of the night, or first thing in the morning, it's important that you try to relax into this. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this will probably seem strange to you. So give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Rods on Rails by Samuel Sidney. Preface. The following pages are an attempt to supply something amusing, instructive, and suggestive to travelers who, not caring particularly where they go or how long they stay at any particular place, may wish to know something of the towns and districts through which they pass, on their way to Wales, the Lakes of Cumberland, or the Highlands of Scotland. Or to those who, having a brief vacation, may wish to employ it among pleasant rural scenes, and in investigating the manufactures, the mines, and other sources of commerce and influence of this small island and great country. In performing this task, I relied partly on personal observation, partly on notes, and the memory of former journeys, and where needful have used the historical information to be found in encyclopedias and local guidebooks. This must account for, if it does not excuse, the unequal space devoted to districts with equal claims to attention. But it would take years, if not a lifetime, to render the manuscript of so discursive a work complete and correct. I feel that I have been guilty of many faults of commission and omission, but if the friends of those localities to which I have not done justice will take the trouble to forward to me any facts or figures of public general interest, they shall be carefully embodied in any future edition, should the book, as I hope it will, arrive at such an honour and profit. S.S. London, August, 1851. London and North Western Railway. According to Mr. Punch, one of the greatest authorities of the day on all such subjects. The nearest way to Euston Station is to take a cab, but those who are not in a hurry may take advantage of the omnibuses that start from Gracechurch Street and Charing Cross, traversing the principal thoroughfares and calling at the George and Blue Boar, Holborn, the Green Man and still Oxford Street, and the booking offices in Regent Circus. Euston, including its dependency, Camden Station, is the greatest railway port in England, or indeed the world. It is the principal gate through which flows and reflows the traffic of a line, which has cost more than 22 million sterling, which annually earns more than 2.5 million for the conveyance of passengers and merchandise and livestock, and which directly employs more than 10,000 servants, besides the tens of thousands to whom, in mills or mines, in ironworks, in steamboats and coasters, it gives indirect employment. What London is to the world, Euston is to Great Britain. There is no part of the country to which railway communication has extended, with the exception of the Dover and Southampton lines, which may not be reached by railway conveyance from Euston Station. The Buckinghamshire lines from Bletchley open the way through Oxford to all the western counties, only interrupted by the break of gauge. The Northampton and Peterborough from Blisworth proceeds to the eastern coast of Norfolk and Lincoln. At Rugby commences one of several roads to the north, either by Leicester, Nottingham and Lincoln, or by Derby and Sheffield. And at Rugby too we may either proceed to Stafford by the direct route of the Trent Valley, a line which is rendered classical by the memory of Sir Robert Peel, who turned its first sod with a silver spade, and honoured its opening by celebrated speech. Or we may select the old line through Coventry, Birmingham and Wolverhampton, passing through a network of little railways leading to Warwick and Leamington, the result of unprofitable competition. A continuation of the Trent Valley line intersects the pottery district, where the cheapest Delft and the most exquisite specimens of China ware are produced with equal success, and thus we reach Liverpool and Manchester by the straightest possible line. At Stafford we can turn off to Shrewsbury and Chester, or again following the original route arrive at Crewe, the great workshop and railway town of the London and North Western. Crewe affords an ample choice of routes, first to Leeds by Stockport, with a branch to Macclesfield and Huddersfield, or from Leeds to York or to Harrogate, and so on by the East Coast line through Durham, Newcastle and Berwick, to Edinburgh. Secondly, direct to Manchester. Thirdly, to Warrington, Newton, Wigan and the north, through the salt mining country. And fourthly, through Chester. At Chester we may either push on to Ireland by way of the Holyhead Railway, crossing the famous Britannia Tubular Bridge, or to Birkenhead, the future rival of Liverpool. At Liverpool, steamers for America wanted to reach New York in 10 days are at our command. Or, leaving commerce, cotton and wool, we may ride through the proud Preston and Lancaster to Kendal and Windermere and the Lake District, or pressing forward through merry Carlisle, reach Gretna at a pace that defies the competition of fathers and guardians, and enter Scotland on the direct road to Glasgow, and if necessary, ride on to Aberdeen and Perth. A short line from Camden Station opens a communication with the East and West India Docks and the coast of Essex, and another 3.5 miles in length from Willesden Station will shortly form a connection with the South-Western, and thereby with all the South and Western lines from Dover to Southampton. The railway system of which the lines above enumerated form so large a part is barely 25 years old. In that space of time we have not only supplied the home market, but taught Europe and America to follow our example. Even Egypt and India will soon have their railways, and we now look with no more surprise on the passage of a locomotive with a few hundred passengers or tons of goods than on a wheelbarrow or patent hansom cab. Grouse from Aberdeen, fat cattle from Norfolk, piece goods from Manchester, hardwares from Sheffield, racehorses from Newmarket, coals from Leicestershire, and schoolboys from Yorkshire are dispatched and received for the distance of a few hundred miles with the most perfect regularity as a matter of course. We take a ticket to dine with a friend in Chester or Liverpool, or to meet the hounds near Bletchley or Rugby, as calmly as we engage a cab to go a mile. We consider 20 miles an hour disgustingly slow, and grumble awfully at a delay of 5 minutes in a journey of 100 miles. Millions have been spent in order to save an hour and a half between London and Liverpool. Yet there are plenty of men, not much past 30, who remember when all respectable, plain, practical, common-sense men looked upon the project for a railway between London and Birmingham as something very wild, if not very wicked. And I remember too that in winter the journey from London to Liverpool often occupied them 22 hours, costing £4 inside and £2 out, besides having to walk up the steepest hills in Derbyshire. The same journey which is now completed in 6 hours at the cost of £2 5 shillings, and in 12 hours for 16 shillings 9 pence by the parliamentary train in an enclosed carriage. It may be perhaps useful, wholesome lesson to those who are in the habit of accepting as their just due, without thought, without thankfulness, the last best results of the industry and ingenuity of centuries. If before entering the massive portals of Euston Station we dig up a few passages of the early history of railways, from dusty blue books and forgotten pamphlets. In 1826, the project of a railway from Liverpool to Manchester came before a committee of the House of Commons, and after a long investigation, the principle was approved, but the bill thrown out in consequence of defects in the survey. The promoters rested their case entirely on a goods traffic to be conveyed at the rate of 6 or 7 miles per hour. The engineer was George Stephenson, the father of the railway system, a man of genius, who, although he clearly foresaw the ultimate results of his project, had neither temper nor tact enough to conciliate the ignorant obstinacy of his opponents. In fact, he was a very bad witness and a very great man. It is curious in reading the evidence to observe the little confidence the counsel for the bill had in the engineer, and the contempt with which the counsel for the opposition treated him. The promoters of the railway expected few passengers, hoped to lower the rates of canals, and had not made up their minds whether to employ locomotives or horses. George Stephenson looked forward confidently at that same period to conveying the greater portion of the goods and passenger traffic by a complete railway system. But he either would not or could not explain the grounds of his confidence, and therefore we find Mr. Harrison, the most eminent parliamentary counsel of that day, speaking in the following insolent strain of a man whose genius he and his friends were unable to appreciate. Every part of this scheme shows that this man, George Stephenson, has applied himself to a subject of which he has no knowledge, and to which he has no science to apply. When we set out with the original prospectus, we were to gallop at the rate of 12 miles an hour, with the aid of the devil in the form of a locomotive, sitting as a postilion on the forehorse. But the speed of these locomotives has slackened. The learned sergeant would like to go to 7, but he will be content with 6 miles an hour. I will show that he cannot go to 6. Practically or for any useful purposes, they may go at something more like 4 miles an hour. The wind will affect them. Any gale of wind which would affect the traffic on the Mersey would render it impossible to set off a locomotive engine, either by poking the fire or keeping up the pressure of the steam until the boiler burst. A shower of rain retards a railway, and snow entirely stops it. In reply, Mr. Adams modestly observed, "I should like my learned friend to have pointed out any part of the publication in favour of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which justified his statement that we professed that goods were to be carried at the rate of 12 miles an hour. We have proved that they can be carried at 7 miles an hour, and it was never intended that they should be conveyed at a higher rate." In the following year, the Liverpool and Manchester Bill was carried, and in 1830 the career of the civilizing locomotive commenced. But it took many more years to convince practical men that the railway would successfully compete with the coach and canal. When in 1831 the scheme of a railway between London and Birmingham was made public, a very clever pamphlet appeared under the title of Beware the Bubbles, in which we find the following comical prognostications of the results of railways. After all, what advantage does the London and Birmingham Railway hold out? Only one: celerity of motion. And after all, the 10 miles an hour is absolutely slower than the coaches, some of which go as fast as 11 or 12 miles an hour. And with the length of time that the engine and its cumbrous engine requires ere it can stop, and the other contingencies, there would be little difference in the time of a 12 miles an hour coach and a 15 miles an hour engine, supposing 20 or 30 stoppages to pick up little parcels between London and Birmingham. The conveyance is not so safe as by coach. After enumerating a series of theoretical dangers, he proceeds. Another consideration which would deter invalids, ladies, and children from making use of the railway would be want of accommodation along the line, unless the directors of the railway chose to build inns at their own expense. But those inns the directors would have, in great part, to support, because they would be so out of the way of any business except that arising from the railway, and that would be trifling. Commercial travellers would never by any chance go by railroad. The occasional traveller, who went by the same route for pleasure, would go by the coach road also, because of the cheerful company and comfortable dinner. Not one of the nobility, the gentry, or those who travel in their own carriages would really like to be drawn at the tail of a train of wagons, in which some hundreds of bars of iron were jingling with a noise that would drown all the bells of the district, and in momentary apprehension of having his vehicle broken to pieces, and himself killed or crippled by the collision of those 32-ton masses. Even if a man had no carriage of his own, what inducement could he have to take so ungainly a conveyance? 3 hours is more than the maximum difference by which the ordinary speed of coaches could be exceeded, and it is not one traveller in 1,000 to whom an arrival in London and Birmingham 3 hours sooner would be of the slightest consequence. Then, as to goods, the only goods that require velocity in coming to London are ribbons from Coventry. Half the luggage room of a coach on a Saturday night is quite adequate to the conveyance of them. The manufacturers of Coventry will never be such fools as to send their property on an errand by which it must travel further and fare worse. For heavy goods, the saving by canal would be as 12 to 1, besides the perfect safety. In the canal boat there is no danger of fracture, even to the most delicate goods, whereas if fine China goods were to be brought by the rapid wagons, the breakage would probably be 25%. As to the profits of the undertaking, let us be extravagantly liberal. Suppose that the railway was to get 1/3 of the goods, as well as 1/3 of the passengers. See what they would make of it. 1/3 of the goods, £96,540. 1/3 of the passengers, £30,240. Total, £126,780. Annual expenses, £385,000. Returns, £126,780. Annual deficiency, £258,220. To meet an outlay of £7.5 million. but the probability is that canals would reduce their rates one half, and thus, competing wholesomely, extinguish the railway. The coachmasters would do the same thing. Run for 12 months at half the present fares, and then not one man in his senses would risk his bones on the railway. The innkeepers would follow a course precisely similar, and give nice smoking dinners, foaming tankards and bottles of beeswing at so cheap a rate, and meet their customers with so good-humoured faces, and do so many of those kind offices that legions would flock to the hospitable road. And while all of this was going on, and the thousands of men which the authors of this ridiculous scheme had expected to send upon the parish were thriving, the solitary stranger who had nobody to tell him better would go swinging at the tail of the engine, bumping first on the iron plates on this side, and then on the iron plates on that side, and if escape being scolded to death by the bursting of his engine, or having all his bones broken by collision with another, he would be fain to rest for the night within some 4 bare walls, and gnaw a mouldy crust which he brought in his pocket. Or as an alternative of luxury, wade some 10 miles through the mire, and feast upon a rasher of rusty bacon and a tankard of the smallest ale at the nearest hedge alehouse. All this now sounds inexpressibly droll, and yet this prophet of evil was not entirely wrong. Nay, in some important particulars he was more right than the railway promoters, whom he so heartily detested. The railway did cost nearly 7 millions instead of 4 millions, as calculated by the projectors, and the cost of working before the amalgamation with the Grand Junction did amount to £380,000 per annum. 2 figure facts which would have effectually crushed speculation could they have been provided in 1831. But then the per contra of traffic was equally astounding in its overflow. Instead of 1/3 of the existing traffic, or £126,800 a year, allowed by the pamphleteer, the London and Birmingham earned a gross revenue of nearly £900,000, while still leaving a traffic in heavy goods on the canals, sufficient to pay from £6 to £30 per cent to the proprietors, in spite of a reduction of rates of upwards of £50 per cent. Indeed, this traffic actually increased on the Grand Junction Canal since the opening of the railway, from £750,000 in 1836 to £1,160,000 in 1847. Perhaps on no point would the expectation of the most sanguine among the early projectors of railways been more satisfactorily exceeded than in regard to safety. Swiftness and cheapness and power, acute intelligent engineers foresaw, but that millions of passengers should be whirled along at speed varying from 20 to 50 miles an hour with more safety than they could have secured by walking afoot would have seemed an anticipation of the very wildest character. Yet such is the case. In 1850, upwards of 70 million souls were conveyed by railway, when 11 passengers were killed and 54 injured, or less than 1 to each million of passengers conveyed. Even at the risk of seeming trite, prosy, and commonplace, it is right to remind the young generation who consider the purchase of a railway ticket gives them a right to grumble at 1,000 imaginary defects and deficiencies in railway management. How great are the advantages in swiftness, economy, and safety, which they enjoy through the genius enterprise and stubborn perseverance of George Stephenson and his friends and pupils in 1825. Euston Station. This station was an afterthought, the result of early experience in railway traffic. Originally, the line was to have ended in Camden Town, but a favourable opportunity led to the purchase of 15 acres, which has turned out most convenient for the public and the proprietors. It is only to be regretted that it was not possible to bring the station within a few yards of the new road, so as to render the stream of omnibuses between Paddington and the city available, without compelling the passenger to perspire under his carpet bag, railway wrapper, umbrella, and hatbox, all the way from the platform to the edge of Euston Square. The Great Gateway, or proper pallium, is very imposing and rather out of place. But that is not the architect's fault. It cost £30,000, and had he been permitted to carry out his original design, no doubt it would have introduced us to some classic fane and character with the lofty Titanic columns. For instance, a temple to Mercury, the winged messenger and god of Mammon. But, as is very common in this country, for familiar examples see the London University, the National Gallery, and the Nelson Column. The spirit of the proprietors evaporated with the outworks, and the gateway leads to a square courtyard, in a building the exterior of which may be described, in the language of guidebooks when referring to something which cannot be praised, as a plain, unpretending stucco structure, with a convenient wooden shed in front, barely to save passengers from getting wet in rainy weather. As Melrose should be seen by the fair moonlight, so Euston, to be viewed to advantage, should be visited by the grey light of a summer or spring morning, about 6:15, 3/4 of an hour before the starting of the parliamentary train, which every railway, under a wise legislative enactment, is compelled to run once a day from each extremity, with covered carriages, stopping at every station, travelling at a rate of not less than 15 miles an hour, at a charge of 1 penny per mile. We say wise because the competition of the railway for goods as well as passengers drove off the road not only all the coaches, on which, when light-footed, sore-footed travellers got an occasional lift, but all the variety of vans and broad-wheeled wagons which afforded a slow but cheap conveyance between our principal towns. At the hour mentioned, the railway passenger yard is vacant, silent, and as spotlessly clean as a Dutchman's kitchen. Nothing is to be seen but a tall, soldier-like policeman in green, on watch under the wooden shed, and a few sparrows industriously yet vainly trying to get breakfast from between the closely packed paving stones. How different from the fat, debauched-looking sparrows who throve upon the dirt and waste of the old coach-yards. It is so still, so open. The tall columns of the portico entrance look down on you so grimly. The front of the booking offices, in their garment of clean stucco, looks so primly respectable that you cannot help feeling ashamed of yourself. Feeling as uncomfortable as when you have called too early on an economically genteel couple, and been shown into a handsome drawing room, on the frosty day without a fire. You cannot think of entering into a gossip with the railway guardian, for you remember that sentinels on duty are not allowed to talk, except to nursery maids. Presently, hurrying on foot, a few passengers arrive. A servant maid carrying a big box, with the assistance of a little girl. A neat, punctual-looking man, probably a banker's clerk on furlough, and a couple of young fellows in shaggy coats, smoking, who seem, by their red eyes and dirty hands, to have made sure of being up early by not going to bed. A rattle announces the first omnibus, with a pile of luggage outside and 5 inside passengers. 2 commercial travellers, 2 who may be curates or schoolmasters, and a brown man with a large sea chest. At the quarter the scene thickens. There are a few hansoms, but some nightcabs, a vast number of carts of all kinds, from the costermonger's donkey to the dashing butcher's Whitechapel. There is very little medium in parliamentary passengers about luggage. Either they have a cartload or none at all. Children are very plentiful, and the mothers are accompanied with large escorts of female relations, who keep kissing and stuffing the children with real Gibraltar rock and gingerbread to the last moment. Every now and then a well-dressed man hurries past into the booking office and takes his ticket with a sheepish air, as if he was pawning his watch. Sailors arrive with their chests and hammocks. The other day we had the pleasure of meeting a travelling tinker with the instruments of his craft neatly packed. Two gentlemen, whose closely cropped hair and pale plump complexion betokened a recent residence in some jail or philanthropic institution. An economical baronet of large fortune, a prize fighter going down to arrange a little affair which was to come off the next day, a half-pay officer with a genteel wife and 12 children, on his way to a cheap county in the north, a party of 7 Irish, father, mother, and 5 grown-up sons and daughters on their way to America after a successful residence in London. A tall young woman and a little man from Stamford who had been up to London to buy stone bottles and carried them back rattling in a box. A handsome dragoon with a very pretty girl, her eyes full of tears, on his arm to see him off. Another female was waiting at the door for the same purpose when the dragoon bolted and took refuge in the interior of the station. In a word, a parliamentary train collects, besides mechanics in search of work, sailors going to join a ship, and soldiers on furlough, all whose necessities or tastes lead them to travel economically, among which last class are to be found a good many Quakers. It is pleasing to observe the attention of the poor women with large families and piles of packages received from the officers of the company, a great contrast to the neglect which meets the poorly clad in stagecoach travelling, as may still be seen in those districts where the rail has not yet made way. We cannot say that we exactly admire the taste of the 3 baronets whom a railway superintendent found in one third-class carriage, but we must own that to those to whom economy is really an object, there is much worse travelling than by the parliamentary. Having on one occasion gone down by first class with an Oxford man who had just taken his M.A., an ensign of infantry in his first uniform, a clerk in Somerset House, and a Manchester man who had been visiting a Whig lord, and returned third class, with a tinker, a tailor just returned from Africa, a bird-catcher with his load, and a gentleman in velveteens, rather greasy, who seemed, probably on a private mission, to have visited the misdemeanor wards of all the prisons in England and Scotland. We preferred the return trip, that is to say, vulgar and amusing to dull and genteel. Among other pieces of information gleaned on this occasion, we learned that for a cove as didn't mind a jolly lot of reading and writing, reading was prime in winter, plenty of good victuals and the cells warmed. It must be remarked that the character of the parliamentary varies very much according to the station from which it starts, the London trains being the worst, having a large proportion of what are vulgarly called swells out of luck. In a rural district, the gathering of smock-frocks and rosy-faced lasses, the rumbling of carts, and the size, number, and shape of the trunks and parcels afford a very agreeable and comical scene on a frosty moonlight. Winter's morning, about Christmas time, when visiting commences, or at Whitsuntide. No man who has a taste for studying the phases of life and character should fail to travel at least once by the parliamentary. The large cheap load having rumbled off from the south side of the station, about 9 o'clock preparations are commenced for the aristocratic express, which, on this line, is composed of first-class carriages alone, in which, at half the price of the old mail coach fares, the principal stations on the line are reached at railway speed. To attend the departure of this train, there arrive not only the Republican omnibuy and cabs, from the damp night crawler to the rattling hansom, but carriages with coronets, and mitres emblazoned, guarded by the tallest and most obsequious of footmen, and driven by the fattest and most lordly of coachmen. Also the neatest of brooms, adorned internally with pale pink and blue butterfly bonnets, dashing dog carts with neat grooms behind, moustached guardsmen driving, and stately cabriolets prance in under the guidance of fresh primrose-covered gloves. But although the passengers by the express train are, in every respect, a contrast to those by the parliamentary, the universal and levelling tendency of the railway system is not less plainly exhibited. The Earl or Duke, whose dignity formerly compelled him to post in a coupe for, had a cost of some 5 or 6 shillings a mile, and an immense consumption of horseflesh, wax lights, and landladies' curtsies on the road, now takes his place unnoticed in a first-class carriage next to a gentleman who travels for a great claret and champagne house, and opposite another going down express to report a railway meeting at Birmingham for a morning paper. If you see a lady carefully and courteously escorted to a carriage marked engaged on a blackboard, it is probably not a countess, but the wife of one of the principal officers of the company. A bishop in a greatcoat creates no sensation, but a tremendous rush of porters and superintendents towards one carriage announces that a director or well-known engineer is about to take his seat. In fact, civility to all, gentle and simple, is the rule introduced by the English railway system. Every porter with a number on his coat is, for the time, the passenger's servant. Special attention is bestowed on those who are personally known, and no one can grumble at that. Some people who have never visited the continent, or only visit it for pleasure, travelling at their leisure, make comparisons with the railways of France and Germany, unfavourable to the English system. Our railways are dearer than the foreign, so is our government. We make both ourselves, but compare the military system of the continental railways, the quarter of an hour for admission before the starting of the train, during which, if too early or too late, you are locked out. The weighing of every piece of baggage, the lordly commanding airs of all the officials if any relaxation of rules be required, the insouciance with which the few porters move about, leaving ladies and gentlemen to drag their own luggage. Compare all this with the rapid manner in which the loads of 6 cabs, driving up from some other railway at the last moment, are transferred to the departing express. Compare the speed, the universal civility, attention, and honesty that distinguish our railway travelling, and you cannot fail to come to the conclusion that for a commercial people to whom time is of value, ours is the best article. And if we had not been a lawyer-ridden people, we might also have had the cheapest article. Before starting the express train, we must not fail to note one new class of passengers, recruited by the speed of railways, the number of gentlemen in breeches, boots, and spurs, with their pinks just peeping out from under their rough jackets, who, during the season, get down to Aylesbury, Bletchley, and even Wolverton, to hunt and back home again to dinner. But the signal sounds. The express train moves off. 2 gentlemen in the last moment are in vain crying out for Punch and the Times. One unheeded hammering at the closed door of the booking office announces that somebody is too late. There is always someone too late. On this occasion it was a young gentleman in a pair of light top boots, and a mamma and papa, with 6 children and 2 nursery maids in a slow, capacious fly. We cannot bestow unqualified praise upon the station arrangements at Euston. Comfort has been sacrificed to magnificence. The platform arrangements for departing and arriving trains are good, simple and comprehensive. But the waiting rooms, refreshment stand, and other conveniences are as ill contrived as possible. while a vast hall with magnificent roof and scagliola pillars appears to have swallowed up all the money and all the light of the establishment. The first-class waiting room is dull to a fearful degree, and furnished in the dowdiest style of economy. The second-class room is a dark cavern with nothing better than a borrowed light. The refreshment counters are enclosed in a sort of circular glazed pew, open to all the draughts of a grand, cold, uncomfortable hall, into which few ladies will venture. The refreshment room should be the ante-room to the waiting room, and the two should be so arranged, with reference to the booking office and cloakrooms, that strangers find their way without asking a dozen questions from busy porters and musing policemen. Euston Station reminds us of an architect's house, where a magnificent portico and hall leads to dungeon-like dining room and mean drawing room. Why are our architects so inferior to our engineers? On the platform is the door of the telegraph office, which also has offices for receiving and transmitting messages at all the principal stations. The mixed train. The mixed train on this line holds an intermediate rank between the parliamentary and the express, consisting as it does of first and second class carriages, at lower fares than the one and higher than the other, stopping at fewer stations than the parliamentary and at more than the express, but with notice on the present occasion, because it is by these trains only that horses and carriages are allowed to be conveyed. Carriages require very careful packing on a truck. At the principal stations this may very well be left to the practiced porters, but at roadside stations it is a point which should be looked into, for it has not unfrequently happened that the jogging, natural motion of the railway has heated the axles of a carriage or truck, so that at the end of the journey the wheels have been found as fast as if they had been welded and quite unfit to travel. Travelling in a carriage on a truck is by no means safe. Some years since Lady Zetland and her maids were nearly burnt to death, sparks from the engine having set fire to their luggage. The maid threw herself off the truck and had an extraordinary escape. The arrangements of the boxes for carrying horses are now very complete, and when once a horse, not of a naturally nervous disposition, had been accustomed to travel by rail, it will often be found better to take him on to hunt at a distance than to send him overnight to a strange place, with all the disadvantages of change of food, and temptations to neglect on the way of the groom. It is, however, a class of traffic to which few of the railway companies have paid much attention, yet, in our opinion, capable of great development under a system of moderate fares and day tickets. The rates are not always stated in the timetables, but on the London and North Western, a day ticket for a horse costs 14 shillings for 30 miles. Besides horses, packs of hounds and even red deer are occasionally sent by rail, but deer travel in their own private carriages. Hounds are generally accompanied by the huntsman or whip to keep them in order. And on the Great Western Line a few years ago, a huntsman was nearly stifled in this way. The van had been made too snug and close for travelling comfortably with 20 couple of warm foxhounds. If there is ever the slightest doubt about a horse entering the van quietly, the best way is to blindfold him before he becomes suspicious. Among other pursuits, horse racing has been completely revolutionized by the rail. The posting horse race van was a luxury in which only the wealthiest could indulge to a limited extent. But now the owner of a string of thoroughbreds, or a single plater, can train in the south or the north, and in 24 hours reach any leading course in the kingdom, carrying with him, if deemed needful, hay, straw, and water. As we move slowly off toward Camden Station, by the fourth of the 18 passenger trains which daily depart from Euston, and emerging with light whirl along the sight of rows of capital houses, whose gardens descend to the edge of the cuttings. We are reminded that under the original Act for taking up Euston, it was specifically provided, at the instance of Lord Southampton, that no locomotive should be allowed to proceed further to the south than Camden Town, lest his building land should remain neglected garden land forever. This promise was accepted with little reluctance by the company, because in 1833 it was popularly considered that the ascent to reach Camden Town could not be easily overcome by heavily loaded locomotive. Consequently, a pair of stationary engines were erected at Camden Town, and a pair of tall chimneys to carry off their smoke and steam. But the objections in taste and difficulties in science have vanished. On this line, as on all others, tenants are readily found for houses fringing a cutting. Locomotives run up even such ascents as the Bromsgrove Lickey between Worcester and Birmingham, with a load of 500 tons. So 10 minutes have been saved in time and much expense by doing away with the rope traction system. The stationary engines have been sold and are now doing duty on a flaxmill in Russia, and the two tall columns, after slumbering for several years as monuments of prejudices and obstacles overcome, were swept away to make room for other improvements. It is, however, very odd, and not very creditable to human nature, that whenever a railway is planned, the proprietors are assailed by unreasonable demands for compensation, in cases where past experience has proved that the works will be an advantageous and often an ornamental addition. In 1846, a Sheffield line was vehemently opposed by a Liverpool gentleman, on the ground that it would materially injure the prospect from a mansion, which had been the seat of his ancestors for centuries. The tale was well told and seemed most pitiful. An impression was produced on committee that the privacy of something like Hatfield or Nebworth was about to be infringed on by the abominable railway. A stiff cross-examination brought out this reluctant fact, however, that this house of my ancestors, this beautiful Elizabethan mansion, had been for many years let as a lunatic asylum at £36 per annum. In another instance, a railway director sold a pretty country seat because the grounds were about to be intersected by a railway embankment. 2 years after the completion of the railway, he wished to buy it back again, for he found that its successor, by turfing and planting the slope, had very much increased the original beauty of the gardens. And I think I'm going to call it that for tonight. I think this is a really good candidate for something to help people sleep, because so far we've just had a whole bunch of geography. If you'd like to pick up where we left off, you can, as always, find this on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytimetales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you get a restful night. New episodes are released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.